So we think that this emphasis on the fact that we are suddenly somehow taking away all of the money that these countries have is really quite a flawed idea for a couple of different reasons that I'm going to be exploring in more depth in my rebuttal later on. But mainly we think it's flawed because inherent in our model is the fact that there is a significant incentive to improve, because when you improve in steps, you get some of that money back. And so we don't think that any of the analysis about governments hoarding more money and spending less of their resources in such corrupt ways is necessarily valid. So 3 questions in today's debate. What is the best way to achieve a stable political situation in these countries? How is the best way to help the poorest of the poor in these countries? And finally, how best to achieve economic development in these countries. So looking first at this idea of political stability. And we brought you very early on the idea that when you have significant income from natural resources, you don't need to tax your people. In response to that, we had that less tax generally makes people, more happy, which means that they like their government more. But to that, we would like to say, first off, that not taxing your people is not a sustainable way of maintaining an economy. But secondly, the fact that the government doesn't tax their people, and this leads to a decrease in discourse, is because it means that the government doesn't need their people in order to maintain their revenue. So they don't need to keep the goodwill of these people. They don't need to work with their people because they have a monopoly on the money and the power in this situation. In taking away that monopoly on the money, what we are doing is we are forcing them to work with the people of their country in a better way. We also had this idea that, corrupt governments will always hoard their money. But we really think that because of the incremental way in which we're giving the money back through our model means that there is an incentive to spend in a way that improves the economic development and the stability of your country visibly, and so that the UN will accept it. We also think that this idea that UN countries have vested interests in the way in which this will happen is somewhat ludicrous, because we think that this is fairly transparent. We think that countries will be, sorry, I can't read the writing. We already think that aid functions really quite well. We think that these countries will, because of the number of countries who are in the UN, who each have different interests and different levels of power, we think that these vested interests will be kind of moved against and dealt with. We don't think it will be necessarily the biggest issue. So moving on to how the best way to help the poorest of the poor in these countries is. And we had this kind of cute idea that, there would be $1 extra for all the poor people who work for these natural resource extractions. And we brought you at second the fact that because most of this production and extraction is based off machinery, that benefit will only go to a small number of people, and we don't feel like we got a good enough response on that material. We also think that the idea that there would be no further investment in human capital because they don't have enough money to, and no incentive to, is really dealt with by our model. And also because because of the fact that they now can't only get their revenue from natural resources, they're going to have to branch out into other things. They're going to have to train their workforce to work in other ways. And we thought that this idea that currently under the status quo there is an incentive to educate your workforce was kind of naive, because all you need your workforce to be able to do when your main source of income is based off machinery is press specific buttons or move specific things. You don't need to teach them higher level things. You don't need to train them specifically for complex stuff. And what this means is that there is no incentive there to educate in any meaningful way. We also think that the idea that there would be more hospitals built because you need a healthy workforce doesn't necessarily have much of an effect because of two reasons. The first thing is that you want a healthy workforce under any situation, and particularly when you have a more diverse workforce where your focus is more on the labour force rather than on the capital and machinery side of things, and so there will be a greater focus on hospitals. But secondly, because currently there are so few people who are in the workforce, you don't need many medical facilities to care for those people. So we also, moving now on to the best way to achieve economic development. And we had this idea come out from the team over here that we need this money to develop in the first place, and taking away all of the money at once is going to be really bad. To that we would say, though, that there are different types of economic development, and developing in a way which exploits your people, which doesn't use them as workers and just basically rides on this big boom of economic resources natural resources is not sustainable, and really doesn't lead to a high quality of life for the people in this country. So what this means is that, like we saw in Nigeria with their boom, they will rise and then fall. They will fall into debt, they will fall into their agriculture industry being discredited because of the issues with Dutch disease, where because the dollar of the country has risen so high through their trade of natural resources, no one wants to import any of their other goods. So what we think is that because of this, it is very important to incentivise diversity. So because we are the team which today has stood for widespread employment within this country, rather than a focus on machinery, a quick, easy way to rise quickly in economics, rather than actually a sustainable, progressive way, and because we form the best way to have a stable political system with discourse between government and people, we are very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank Kate